the scorching sun beat down on the immaculate driveway of the Blackwood estate, a sprawling mansion that stood as a testament to the wealth and power of its owner, Jonathan Blackwood. At the age of 55, Jonathan was the embodiment of arrogance and success, his salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed and his tailored suit worth more than most people's yearly salary. As he strode towards his gleaming Rolls-Royce, Jonathan's piercing blue eyes fell upon the figure of his driver, Mark Thompson. At 35, Mark was everything Jonathan despised: humble, kind-hearted, and from a working-class background. Yet, for the past 5 years, Mark had been an impeccable employee, always punctual, always respectful, and always ready to go above and beyond his duties. "Thompson," Jonathan barked, his voice laced with contempt. "I hope you've polished this car to perfection. I have an important meeting, and I won't tolerate a single speck of dust on my vehicle." Mark nodded politely, his warm brown eyes betraying no hint of resentment at his employer's harsh tone. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I've made sure everything is in order for your meeting." As Mark opened the car door for his boss, Jonathan sneered. "You know, Thompson, sometimes I wonder why I keep you around. A trained monkey could do your job." The words stung, but Mark maintained his composure. "I appreciate the opportunity to work for you, sir," he replied softly. Little did Jonathan know that behind Mark's gentle demeanor lay a secret that could shatter the very foundations of the Blackwood Empire. As the Rolls-Royce glided through the streets of New York City, Mark's mind wandered to the events that had led him to this point in his life. Born into a loving but impoverished family in a small town in Ohio, Mark had always dreamed of making something of himself. He'd worked tirelessly through high school and college, taking on multiple jobs to pay for his education. It was during one of those jobs, as a waiter at a high-end restaurant, that he first encountered the Blackwood family. Jonathan had been there with his wife, Victoria, and their daughter, Emily. Mark had been struck by Emily's beauty and kindness, so different from her father's cold demeanor. Over the next few months, Emily had returned to the restaurant alone, always requesting to be seated in Mark's section. They'd struck up a friendship, which had blossomed into a secret romance. For a brief, beautiful moment, Mark had believed that love could conquer all, even the vast chasm of social class that separated them. But reality had come crashing down when Jonathan discovered their relationship. Using his influence and wealth, he'd ensured that Mark lost his job and his scholarship, effectively crushing his dreams of a better life. It was only through a twist of fate and Victoria Blackwood's guilty conscience that Mark had been offered the position of the family's driver years later. Now, as he navigated the busy streets of Manhattan, Mark's heart ached with the memory of what he'd lost. Emily had been married off to the son of one of Jonathan's business associates, and Mark had been forced to watch from afar as the love of his life slipped away. The car came to a stop outside a towering skyscraper, home to the headquarters of Blackwood Industries. As Jonathan exited the vehicle, he turned to Mark with a sneer. "I'll be in meetings all day. Don't expect to be paid for sitting around doing nothing." Mark nodded silently, watching as his employer disappeared into the building. He pulled out his phone, checking the time, 9:15 a.m. It would be a long day of waiting, but he was used to it by now. What Mark didn't know was that this day would change everything. Inside the Blackwood Industries building, Jonathan strode confidently into the boardroom, ready to close a deal that would cement his status as one of the most powerful men in New York. But as he entered, he was met with a sea of grim faces. "Jonathan," said Richard Hawthorne, his longtime business partner and closest thing to a friend. "We need to talk." Over the next hour, Jonathan's world came crashing down around him. The SEC had launched an investigation into Blackwood Industries, uncovering a web of fraud, embezzlement, and insider trading that stretched back decades. Jonathan's empire was built on a foundation of lies, and now it was all crumbling. As he stumbled out of the building, his mind reeling from the shock, Jonathan found himself face to face with a group of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in his face, and a barrage of questions assaulted him. "Mr. Blackwood, is it true that you've been cooking the books for years? How do you respond to allegations of massive fraud? Are you going to step down as CEO?" Panic seized him, and Jonathan frantically searched for an escape. His eyes landed on Mark, still waiting patiently by the car. "Thompson," he bellowed. "Get me out of here now." Mark sprang into action, quickly maneuvering the Rolls-Royce through the crowd of reporters and whisking his employer away from the chaos. As they sped through the city, Jonathan's composure crumbled entirely. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his face ashen. "I've lost everything. My reputation, my company, it's all gone." For the first time in years, Mark felt a twinge of pity for the man who had caused him so much pain. "Sir," he said gently, "where would you like me to take you?" Jonathan looked up, his eyes wild with desperation. "Home," he croaked. "Take me home." As they pulled up to the Blackwood estate, Victoria and Emily rushed out to meet them. News traveled fast in their circles, and they had already heard about the scandal engulfing Blackwood Industries. "Jonathan, darling," Victoria cried, her perfectly manicured hand covering her mouth in shock. "Tell me it isn't true." Emily stood silently, her eyes meeting Mark's for a brief, charged moment before she turned her attention to her father. "Dad," she said softly, "what's going on?" Jonathan pushed past them, stumbling into the house without a word. Victoria hurried after him, leaving Emily alone with Mark for the first time in years. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." He offered her a sad smile. "There's nothing to say, Miss Blackwood. I'm just the driver, remember?" Emily flinched at his words, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy between them. "You've never been just the driver, Mark. You know that." Before Mark could respond, Victoria's voice rang out from inside the house. "Emily! Come inside this instant." With one last, longing look at Mark, Emily turned and hurried into the mansion, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of secrets that threatened to change everything. As night fell over the Blackwood estate, Mark sat in the small apartment above the garage that served as his living quarters. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He thought of Jonathan Blackwood, the man who had crushed his dreams and treated him with contempt for years, now brought low by his own greed and arrogance. He thought of Victoria, always kind but ultimately complicit in her husband's cruelty. And he thought of Emily, the woman he had never stopped loving, trapped in a loveless marriage and a life she had never wanted. Mark's hand hovered over the locked drawer in his desk, the one that contained the evidence he had gathered over the years, evidence that could destroy what was left of the Blackwood family forever. It had been his insurance policy, his way of protecting himself from Jonathan's wrath. But now, faced with the family's downfall, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about. Justice and revenge. A soft knock at his door startled him from his reverie. He opened it to find Emily standing there, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. Please." He hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. As she entered his modest living space, Mark was struck by how out of place she looked, a diamond in a setting of plain glass. "I'm sorry," Emily began, wringing her hands nervously. "I'm sorry for everything, for what my father did to you, for not fighting harder for us, for letting you go." Mark's heart clenched at her words. "Emily," he said gently, "you don't have to apologize. We were young, and your father—" "No," she interrupted, her eyes flashing with a determination he remembered all too well. "I was a coward, Mark. I let my father dictate my life, and I've regretted it every day since." She took a step closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume, the same one she had worn all those years ago. But now everything's changing. The company, my father's reputation, it's all falling apart. And I can't help but think that maybe this is our chance. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Our chance for what? Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers. For us, Mark. For the life we should have had. For a moment, Mark allowed himself to hope. But then reality came crashing back, and he gently pulled his hand away. Emily, you're married. Your family is in crisis. This isn't the time for. I don't love him, she said fiercely. I never have. It's always been you, Mark. Always. The air between them crackled with tension, years of unspoken feelings threatening to burst forth. But before Mark could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, his face paling as he read the contents. What is it? Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. Mark looked up at her, conflict raging in his eyes. It's about your father. There's something you need to know. As Mark wrestled with the decision of whether to reveal the secrets he had kept for so long, little did he know that his world, and the world of the Blackwood family, was about to be turned upside down in ways none of them could have imagined. Mark's phone buzzed again, insistent and ominous. He glanced at Emily, her expectant face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp in his modest apartment. The weight of the secret he'd carried for years pressed down on him like a physical force. Emily, he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to change everything. Are you sure you want to know? She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. I'm tired of living in the dark, Mark. Whatever it is, I need to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, Mark retrieved a manila folder from the locked drawer of his desk. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to Emily. Your father, he's not the man you think he is. The scandal at Blackwood Industries? It's just the tip of the iceberg. Emily opened the folder, her brow furrowing as she scanned the documents inside. Bank statements, surveillance photos, and transcripts of phone conversations painted a picture of corruption far beyond what had been reported in the news. Oh my God, she whispered, her face pale with shock. Money laundering, connections to organized crime. Dad, what have you done? Mark watched her carefully, his heart aching for the pain he knew this revelation would cause her. There's more, Emily. Your father, he's been using the company as a front for illegal activities for years. And he's implicated a lot of powerful people in the process. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Mark's with a fierce intensity. How long have you known about this? He swallowed hard, knowing that his next words could destroy any chance of reconciliation between them. I've been gathering evidence for the past 3 years. At first, it was just to protect myself. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized how extensive the corruption was. 3 years? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. You've known all this time and you never said anything? I wanted to, Mark said, his voice pleading. But I was afraid. Your father, he's a dangerous man, Emily. I've seen what happens to people who cross him. Emily stood abruptly, pacing the small room as she tried to process the bombshell that had just been dropped on her. I can't believe this. My whole life, everything I thought I knew, it's all been a lie. Mark stepped towards her, reaching out to offer comfort, but she flinched away from his touch. Don't, she said, her voice sharp with pain and betrayal. I need time to think. Without another word, Emily rushed out of the apartment, leaving Mark alone with the weight of his revelations. He sank onto his bed, his head in his hands, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Meanwhile, inside the Blackwood mansion, Jonathan paced his study like a caged animal. The events of the day had left him reeling, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Victoria sat on the plush leather sofa, a glass of scotch in her trembling hand. "We'll weather this storm, Jonathan," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "We always do." Jonathan whirled on her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and rage. "You don't understand, Victoria. This isn't some minor scandal we can sweep under the rug. If the full extent of what I've done comes to light..." He trailed off, unable to voice the consequences that loomed over them. A soft knock at the door interrupted their tense conversation. "Come in," Jonathan barked, expecting it to be one of the household staff. Instead, Emily entered, her face a mask of barely contained emotion. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk." Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he took in his daughter's disheveled appearance. "What is it, Emily? This isn't a good time for dash." "I know everything," Emily interrupted, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "The money laundering, the connections to organized crime, all of it." The color drained from Jonathan's face as he realized the implications of his daughter's words. "Who told you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Emily lifted her chin defiantly. "It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that it's true, isn't it?" Victoria gasped, her glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. "Jonathan," she whispered, "what is she talking about?" For a moment, the great Jonathan Blackwood seemed to shrink before their eyes, the weight of his sins finally catching up to him. But then, like a cornered animal, he lashed out. "You ungrateful little brat," he snarled at Emily. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? By snooping around and believing lies about your own father?" Emily stood her ground, years of pent-up resentment and disappointment fueling her courage. "They're not lies, Dad. I've seen the evidence. How could you do this? How could you build our entire life on a foundation of crime and deceit?" Jonathan's face contorted with rage. He strode across the room, raising his hand as if to strike Emily. But before he could, another figure burst into the study. "Don't you dare touch her!" Mark's voice rang out, filled with a protective fury that surprised even him. Jonathan froze, his hand still raised, as he turned to face the unexpected intruder. "Thompson," he spat, confusion momentarily replacing his anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" Mark moved to stand between Emily and her father, his body tense and ready for confrontation. "I'm here to make sure you don't do something you'll regret, Mr. Blackwood. And to tell you that it's over. All of it." Victoria, who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence, finally found her voice. "Jonathan," she said, her tone pleading, "what's going on? What have you done?" But Jonathan was beyond reason. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful businessman had crumbled, revealing the desperate, cornered man beneath. "You," he snarled, pointing at Mark. "You're behind this, aren't you? You've been spying on me, turning my own daughter against me." Mark stood his ground, meeting Jonathan's furious gaze with a steady one of his own. "No, Mr. Blackwood. You did this to yourself. Your greed, your arrogance, it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down." Emily placed a hand on Mark's arm, drawing strength from his presence. "He's right, Dad. This isn't about Mark, or me, or anyone else. This is about the choices you've made." Jonathan's eyes darted between Mark and Emily, a new suspicion dawning in his mind. "You too," he said, his voice dangerously low. There's something going on between you, isn't there? After all these years. Before either of them could respond, the sound of police sirens pierced the night air, growing steadily louder as they approached the Blackwood estate. "What have you done?" Jonathan roared, lunging at Mark. But Mark was quicker, sidestepping the older man's attack. "I didn't call them, Mr. Blackwood," he said calmly. "But I'm not surprised they're here. Your house of cards was bound to fall sooner or later." As the sirens grew closer, panic set in. Jonathan ran to his desk, frantically shuffling through papers and grabbing his laptop. "I have to get out of here," he muttered, his eyes wild with fear. Victoria stood, her legs shaky but her voice firm. "Jonathan, stop. Running will only make things worse." But her words fell on deaf ears. Jonathan shoved past her, clutching a briefcase filled with who knew what incriminating evidence. He paused at the door, turning to face his family and the man he had underestimated for so long. "This isn't over," he growled, his eyes burning with hatred. "You'll all pay for this betrayal." With that, he was gone, disappearing into the depths of the mansion just as the first police cars pulled up to the front gates. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, stern-faced detectives, and endless questions. Emily and Mark sat side by side on the sofa in the study, providing statements about what they knew of Jonathan's illegal activities. Victoria, shell-shocked and pale, answered questions in a daze, her world having been turned upside down in the span of a single evening. As dawn broke over the Blackwood estate, casting a pale, golden light over the manicured lawns, the full extent of Jonathan's deception began to come to light. News vans lined the street, reporters clamoring for a statement from the family of the man who was now the subject of a nationwide manhunt. Inside, Emily sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee clutched in her hands. Mark stood by the window, watching as the last of the police cars pulled away. "What happens now?" Emily asked, her voice small and uncertain. Mark turned to face her, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever comes next, I'll be here. If you want me to be." Emily looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "After everything that's happened, everything you knew, how can you still want to be here?" Mark moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Because I love you, Emily. I always have. And I know that you're not defined by your father's actions. You're your own person, kind, compassionate, and stronger than you know." A sob escaped Emily's throat as she collapsed into Mark's arms, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking free. They held each other tightly, finding solace in a connection that had endured despite years of separation and secrets. But their moment of peace was short-lived. Victoria burst into the kitchen, her face ashen. "Emily," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." She held out her tablet, where a breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Emily took it with shaking hands, Mark reading over her shoulder. Disgraced CEO Jonathan Blackwood found dead in apparent suicide. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Emily processed the words on the screen. Her father, for all his faults, was gone. The man who had shaped her entire life, for better and for worse, had taken the coward's way out rather than face the consequences of his actions. "Oh, Mom," Emily whispered, standing to embrace her mother. The two women clung to each other, united in their grief and shock. Mark stepped back, giving them space to process this latest blow. But as he watched Emily comfort her mother, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jonathan Blackwood had never struck him as the type to take his own life, no matter how dire the circumstances. As if reading his thoughts, Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his across the room. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, the Blackwood family found themselves at the center of a media firestorm. Every news outlet in the country seemed to be camped outside their gates, hungry for any scrap of information about the scandal that had rocked New York's elite. Emily, thrust into the role of family spokesperson, handled the pressure with a grace and poise that surprised even those who knew her best. She stood before the cameras, her head held high, and promised full cooperation with the authorities in untangling the web of deceit her father had woven. Behind the scenes, however, the strain was beginning to show. Victoria had retreated into herself, spending most of her days in her room with the curtains drawn. Emily worried about her mother's mental state, but she had her hands full dealing with the fallout from her father's crimes. Through it all, Mark remained a steady presence at her side. He had officially resigned from his position as the family's driver, but he never strayed far from Emily's orbit. Together, they pored over financial records and old correspondence, trying to piece together the full extent of Jonathan's illegal activities. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that Emily made a startling discovery. "Mark," she said, her voice tight with tension, "look at this." She pointed to a series of transactions on her father's personal bank statement, large sums of money transferred to an offshore account just days before his death. Mark leaned in, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's unusual. Why would he be moving money around if he was planning to?" He trailed off, not wanting to say the words, but Emily finished the thought for him. "If he was planning to kill himself," she said flatly. "He wouldn't. Which means your father might still be alive," Mark concluded, the implications of this revelation hanging heavy in the air between them. Emily slumped back in her chair, her mind reeling. If he's alive, where is he? And why would he fake his own death? Mark reached out, taking her hand in his. "I don't know," he said softly. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Emily squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world fell away. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the uncertainty of the past few weeks faded into the background as they leaned towards each other, drawn by a force that had never truly diminished over the years. Their lips met in a kiss that was both familiar and exhilaratingly new. It was a promise, a declaration, a moment of peace in the eye of the storm that raged around them. When they finally pulled apart, Emily's cheeks were flushed, and Mark's eyes shone with a mixture of love and determination. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Whatever your father's done, wherever he is, we'll face it together." Emily nodded, feeling for the first time since this nightmare began that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. But as she turned back to the computer screen, her eye caught on something that made her blood run cold. There, buried in the mountain of financial data, was a name she recognized, a name that had no business being mixed up in her father's shady dealings. "Oh my God," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Mark leaned in, concern etched on his face. "What is it? What did you find?" Emily pointed to the name on the screen, her hand shaking slightly. That's my husband's company. Why would my father be transferring money to them?" The implications of this discovery hung heavy in the air. If Emily's husband was involved in Jonathan's illegal activities, it meant that the web of deceit stretched even further than they had imagined. Mark's jaw clenched as he processed this new information. "Emily," he said carefully, "I think it's time we had a talk with your husband." Emily nodded, her face set with determination. "You're right. No more secrets, no more lies. It's time to get to the bottom of this, once and for all." As they prepared to confront Emily's husband, neither of them could have predicted the dangerous path they were about to embark upon, a path that would lead them into the heart of a conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. The next morning, Emily stood in front of her closet, trying to decide what one wears to confront their potentially criminal husband. She settled on a simple black dress. Funeral attire seemed fitting for what might be the death of her marriage. Mark waited for her in the foyer, his usual driver's uniform replaced by a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. As Emily descended the stairs, their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever happened today, they would face it together. "Are you ready for this?" Mark asked softly as he helped her into her coat. Emily took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be." They drove in tense silence to the offices of Rochester Industries, the company owned by Emily's husband, Alexander Rochester. As they pulled up to the towering glass building, Emily felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "Maybe this is a mistake," she said, her hand hesitating on the door handle. "What if we're wrong? What if there's an innocent explanation for all of this?" Mark reached over, gently squeezing her hand. "Then we'll deal with it. But you deserve the truth, Emily. After everything that's happened, you deserve that much." Nodding, Emily steeled herself and stepped out of the car. Together, they walked into the building, past the startled receptionist who recognized Emily from the news coverage of the Blackwood scandal. As they swayed to the soft music drifting up from the streets below, Emily felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. For all the pain and struggle she had endured, she wouldn't change a thing. Every hardship, every betrayal, every moment of doubt had led her to this, a life of purpose, love, and redemption. "You know," Emily said, looking up into Mark's eyes, "when I was a little girl, I used to dream about being a princess in a fairy tale. I thought happiness meant having everything handed to you on a silver platter." Mark smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And now?" Emily's eyes shone with a mix of tears and joy. "Now I know that true happiness comes from earning your place in the world, from fighting for what's right, and from loving deeply, even when it's scary." As they continued to dance under the stars, Emily thought about the long road that had brought her here. From the spoiled heiress she once was, to the strong, compassionate woman she had become. She thought about her father, serving his sentence, and hoped that one day he might find the redemption she had fought so hard for. She thought about her mother, Victoria, who had found her own strength in the wake of scandal, dedicating herself to charitable works and slowly rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. And she thought about Mark, the man who had stood by her through it all. The driver who became her confidant, her partner, her love. As the music faded and the city lights twinkled around them, Emily knew that this was her true happily ever after. Not a fairy tale ending, but something far more valuable, a life of meaning, purpose, and love. "What are you thinking about?" Mark asked, noticing the contemplative look on her face. Emily smiled, her heart full to bursting. "I'm thinking that sometimes, the most beautiful stories are the ones we never saw coming. The ones that challenge us, break us down, and then help us build ourselves back up stronger than ever." Mark nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And our story? What would you call it?" Emily thought for a moment, then laughed softly. "How about The Driver's Secret, a tale of humiliation and triumph? After all, it was your secret that started us down this path." Mark chuckled, pulling her close. "I like it. Though I think the triumph part is all you, Emily. You're the hero of this story." As they shared a tender kiss, the New York skyline stretching out before them like a promise of endless possibilities, Emily knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges to face, more battles to fight in their quest for corporate accountability and social justice. But whatever the future held, she was ready to face it, with Mark by her side, with the strength she had discovered within herself, and with the knowledge that even the darkest chapters can lead to the most beautiful endings. As the night grew late and the city that never sleeps continued its constant hum below, Emily and Mark made their way back to their apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, in the quiet of their home, they had each other and the life they had built together, a life that had emerged from the ashes of scandal and betrayal, transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Emily took one last look at the city skyline from their window, a smile playing on her lips. She thought of all the people out there, facing their own struggles, fighting their own battles. And she renewed her silent promise to keep working, keep fighting, to create a world where integrity triumphed over greed, where justice prevailed over power. As she climbed into bed beside Mark, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was ready. For she had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true strength comes not from wealth or power, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, the resilience to weather life's storms, and the love that sustains us through it all. And as she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had stood by her through it all, Emily knew that this life, this love, this purpose, was the real happy ending she had always been searching for.